A young life snuffed out.
Banaz was a caring, loving young woman with the whole of her life in front of her. And that life has been brutally cut short by the very people that should have loved her and protected her.
A young Kurdish woman in London is the victim of a so-called honour killing. Coming up, the crime her family says she committed that led to her brutal death. Now, they're called honour killings, but there's nothing honourable about them. It's a term used to describe acts of violence committed against women for bringing perceived dishonour to the family. Young women can be marked for death for even simply falling in love with the wrong person. Paula Newton reports on one such story out of London.
In this cell phone video, the story just pours out of Banaz Mahmoud, and so does her panic and fear. As her boyfriend records it all, Banaz lays on a hospital bed, describing what she herself still couldn't believe. It was New Year's Eve 2005 in London, and Banaz's father, an Iraqi Kurd and devout Muslim, told her to grab her suitcase and go with him to her grandmother's. There, she was forced to drink alcohol to prep her for what was to come. She says, I finished the drink, I finished all of it, and then he got up, she says, and left the room. Banaz says when he came back, armed with surgical gloves, she was sure he would try to kill her. She ran from her grandmother's house, smashed a window, hysterical, as she called for help. She ended up in hospital that night, her boyfriend at her side. She told police the whole story. Her family wanted her dead. Banaz had left an abusive marriage arranged by her family and then fell in love with an Iranian Kurd who wasn't part of her clan. She knew her new love, coupled with the failure of her marriage, brought shame to her family, and that they believed the only way to restore the family's pride was through a so-called honor killing. That night, Banaz left this hospital with an offer from authorities, a safe house. She turned that offer down and sealed her fate. She returned to her family believing her father could never bring himself to kill her. He didn't, at least not with his own hands. Just weeks after leaving hospital, Banaz was abducted by two men, raped, strangled with a shoelace, and then her naked body literally packed into this suitcase, only to be found months later buried in a suburban backyard miles from home, that shoelace still tied around her neck. Her boyfriend still lives in hiding with his grief.
They were cruel. They were just heartless people. My life went away pretty much when Banaz did. The only thing which was keeping me going was the moment to see the justice being done for Banaz.
A London court found Mahmoud guilty, convicted of ordering his own daughter's murder. Banaz's uncle, Ari Mahmoud, also convicted of murder. But two men charged with actually carrying out the crime fled back to Iraq.
Banaz was a caring, loving young woman with the whole of her life in front of her. And that life has been brutally cut short by the very people that should have loved her and protected her. In any terms, the ultimate betrayal.
A sobering admission from police, considering their report shows they questioned her version of events. Official figures show as many as a dozen women a year in Britain are the victims of honor killings. But the figure could be much higher. Apparent suicides for young Asian women are 3 times the national average, and there's little explanation for that. Banaz's sister, Bakal, worries about being the family's next target. She now lives at a secret location and wears a full veil, convinced she must hide from her own family. Her arranged marriage fell apart too.
Just escalated to a big argument and all the uncles getting together. And the main one, really, Uncle Ari, he was the one that was saying, you know, if I was his daughter, I should be, you know, killed by now and turned into ashes. You bring his shame.
For her family and clan, Banaz was the picture of shame, deserving of death. Even from the grave, her pleas for help are resonating here as police investigate more than 100 suspicious deaths, wondering how many victims of so-called honor killings have gone unnoticed. Paula Newton, CNN, London.
Well, that case highlights the brutality of honor killings. Across the world, thousands of women live in fear. Crimes go unpunished. Many more cases go unreported. For more on this, we turn now to Zahir Jan Mohammed with Amnesty International. He's the Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks. I want to start by asking you, what kind of mentality is at play in these communities that think it's acceptable to murder a female in the name of honor?
Well, I think unfortunately it's a broader, more universal problem where there's a structural acceptance of violence against women, that being cultural, physical, and emotional violence against women. And I think that there's a permissibility, there's this notion that men have, any right to do whatever they want when it comes to women and to basically legislate their own morality in their own hands. And I think the oftentimes inactions of the state and by community leaders tends to expound this violence.
Let's make a distinction, and I'd like you to clarify for us because it's one that always arises. Is the so-called practice of honor killings, is this about religion or culture?
Well, there's no question that there are elements of religion and culture. There's this notion that people interpret religion in a very oftentimes misogynist manner. But I think at Amnesty International, one thing that we try to do is try to move it to a more universal platform, that this is not just a women's issue, this is not just a religious issue, that this is a broader human rights issue, that the daily violence against women happens throughout the world, and that, indeed this honor crime is horrific, but there are daily violences against women that are occurring in fact in the same community and many other communities which are overlooked. And I think that this honor crime has to be viewed in that broader context.
We've just been putting up some statistics on the screen there, giving people the sense of the scale of this problem. But one of the other things that is worth bringing out, and I'd like you to tell us about, is that females in the family, mothers, sisters, mothers-in-law, very often support these acts.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of sort of the interesting paradoxes, that there is oftentimes support by women. But I think that it's still important to persist onward, that just because there's support by women, or even maybe a victim's own sister, that this is still not permissible. And I think that's oftentimes used as evidence against these women. And I think what happens is that these women have nowhere to turn to and they have no advocate. And I think what's worse is that there is not people speaking out within the community. And I think that is really a crime in itself.
I want to talk about where it's prevalent, where in the world you'd say honor killings are prevalent, and what kind of government response there is in place.
Well, I mean, if you look at, the examples that you put up, Jordan, for example, and Pakistan, those are two governments that have had very dismal responses when it comes to, very lackadaisical response when it comes to honor crimes. And I think that it's important, you look in Pakistan, there's the Hudud ordinance that punishes people for having sex outside of marriage, most of them oftentimes being women. So I think that there's an effort in a lot of societies to control a woman's body, to determine what she can and cannot do, and then to a broader thing of just controlling sexuality.
And you talk about the weak responses that are in place in places like Pakistan. What is Amnesty International itself doing?
Well, Amnesty International has a global campaign called Stop Violence Against Women, and we address the problem on three levels. First, violence by governments. Violence by non-state actors, those are, terrorist groups, other armed militias, etc. And the third is, by ordinary citizens. And I think that there has to be, there's a culture of impunity, that when people commit these acts that they get away with it. And I think that what we're trying to do is trying to put pressure that these acts do not occur, that these acts are punished, and that there is a broader discussion of the danger of these problems so that they can be uprooted.
I know that this campaign, at least one of them in my reading, was started in the early 2000s, around 2003, 2004. How much progress has been made, I suppose, is the key question.
Well, I think it depends on the country. In Pakistan, for example, there's a dynamic woman named Mukhtar Mai, and I think she's done a lot of incredible work in setting up a women's shelter. In other countries, in Iraq, for example, we see that there has been a huge setback when it comes to women's rights. That's true in many other countries, let's say where there's female genital mutilation. So I think it all depends on the context, but I think globally, there is a bit more awareness of the problem of violence against women. Now, has that translated into better actions by states? I don't think so, actually. So I think there has a lot more to be done on this issue.
Zahir Jan Mohammed, unfortunately, there we must leave it. I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.